On this day, we remember the massacre of 6 million Jews.
Today, we remember the terrible events of the Holocaust.
The historic attempt to exterminate the Jewish people, the Shoah, must never be forgotten.
We must hallow their memory.
Antisemitism is rising up in many nations.
We're seeing another rising tide of anti-Semitism.
My friends, not to speak up is to speak up. Not to act in the face of evil is to act itself.
It's so important, I believe, to take a stand against anti-Semitism in all its forms.
The church has a responsibility.
If we forget, it could so easily happen again.
I am very pleased that the Evangelical Lutheran Church of Finland is renouncing anti-Semitism in all its forms so clearly.
May we renew our commitment to stand against all forms of anti-Semitism in our world.
So to all those today who remember the Holocaust and to take a stand against anti-Semitism, we salute you.
I appeal to my Christian brothers and sisters globally.
I also urge all other denominations
to speak up against this evil. We must never allow anti-Semitism to rear its ugly head again. The church has a responsibility to voice and to stand strongly with the Jewish community.
Join us.
Welcome everyone to our webinar on this Holocaust Remembrance Sunday. Some of you may have joined us on Wednesday when we had a Holocaust memorial broadcast from Helsinki. And today we will follow up more in the form of conversation with the topic of what can we as Christians do to stem the tide of rising anti-Semitism. This will be more or less a 1-hour webinar, and I'm very pleased to have with us today, all the way from Washington, D.C., Mark Rogers, who worked for 16 years on Capitol Hill, knows everything there is to know about US politics, and is today the principal of the Clapham Group, where you are in a way working more in the culture which is forming our societies. And it will be very interesting to have your thoughts also on what is happening in the United States, and also how this relates to the question that we will discuss more in depth today. We have another Marcus Österlund from Helsinki, with a PhD from the University of Helsinki. I believe you studied also at Berkeley. You worked in Washington. You have worked in the European Parliament and also on a governmental level in Helsinki. But today you are a pastor of the Evangelical Free Church in Helsinki, Andreas Kyrkan, and he's also my pastor. So we're very happy for all those reasons that you are able to join us today. And you all know Gregory Lafitte, of course, doesn't need any introduction, our Director for UN Affairs, co-founder of the Forum for Cultural Diplomacy. Let us also say that we would be joined by Os Guinness, who had sent us a recorded message. He had wanted to be part of this conversation, but will instead contribute to with his recorded video later in the program. Let me just, as a way of introduction, say that when we compare what happened in the 1930s and we look at the situation today, there is something which, there are things that are similar, but there are also things that are quite different. And what is different compared to the 1930s of now is that in the 30s and the 40s, anti-Semitism and Jew hatred was conducted from a governmental level. And I'm speaking now about the Nazis. Whereas today we have an interesting situation where government policies, by and large, and in Europe and the United States in particular, are very firm in rejecting anti-Semitism in all its forms, whereas the new anti-Semites are mostly to be found on grassroots level. This is also a reason why we as an organization work closely with national governments and with the European Commission in promoting this IRA working definition on anti-Semitism. So let us start there. And let me ask Marcus Österlund, who was one of the first pastors to adopt the IRA working definition on anti-Semitism. And you may have seen, those who are following this webinar, that in a press release we were calling upon churches to do the same, to adopt the working definition of anti-Semitism as an expression of saying that we want to take this fight against anti-Semitism seriously. But Marcus, why did you and the church leadership decide to endorse this working definition?
Thank you, Thomas, and thank you for the possibility to be here with you today. It's a great pleasure. Firstly, I would like to say that we have a very long tradition in our church of standing with the Jewish people. That is something that you, Thomas, know. Already some, I think 100 years ago, there was a group called the Friends of Israel who was formed in our church, and ever since, Israel and standing with the Jewish people has been a core, I would say, of our activities in our church. And I think today, as was said here in the beginning also, I think it is more important than ever to stand with the Jewish people, since the Holocaust has happened, but we know that hatred and anti-Semitism is growing again. And I think what scares me is also when you look on what's happening around you. It has always been in the fringes. You have had people from the left wing and also from the right wing, but more, I would say, in the fringes, kind of more obscure sects almost that has been anti-Semitic. But today you can also see in many countries, even though we don't have governments, but we do have on the right wing, we have Hungary with Orban criticizing the capital, Soros. We have the same situation in the UK with the Labour Party, with Corbyn, and many scandals that you have seen even in established political parties. So I would say that we have, as a church, I see that we have a responsibility to stand up. And one way of doing that is by endorsing the IRA definition. So that's basically a short answer to your question.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, Marcus. And Mark, you are on the other side of the Atlantic, and the situation there, of course, is quite different from what we were used to. But just taking a few more moments just with the issue of churches standing against anti-Semitism, we together reached out to a number of churches, influential churches in the United States, with perhaps mixed results. There were those who were very keen, almost automatically said that this is important, but there were others who were less keen. What is your assessment? Why? I have been told by Americans beforehand that speaking about the Holocaust is a no-go in the United States. Is this correct, or why is it? In that case, why is this the case?
Yes, yeah. And thank you as well for having me join you today. I do appreciate it. Well, listen, I think first three quick things just about the context that we're in. I think it's important to remember that this is such a polarized time in the U.S. and it is throughout the globe. But I think in the U.S. you've seen it, manifest in literally, an assault on the Capitol. I mean, this is such a polarized time that pastors are very hesitant to step into issues in any public way that may divide their congregation. Not that standing against anti-Semitism or addressing the Holocaust would divide their congregation, but they're just cautious to step outside of a kind of a narrow circle of things that are more central to their role in proclaiming the gospel or discipleship. Secondly, there's a lot of demand on them for using their pulpit to communicate, and we talked about that, Thomas, when we outreach, that whether it's Orphan Sunday or whether it's a pro-life Sunday or whatever, there's a lot of demand on them to use their platform to reach their congregations, and they're very cautious as well with how to do that or how often. And then thirdly, and I think this is maybe most important, is they don't have the tools to really navigate these conversations carefully. They don't have trusted tools that are well vetted, that won't create, a misstatement. I mean, there was a recent well-known pastor who did a talk with two well-known evangelicals about racism, and he just stepped on himself. And that, was he was hoping to do the opposite, and creating a good safe space, and it actually created a controversy. So I would say that there are reasons why they're hesitant, and it's not that they are, in some ways anti-Semitic. But I would also just very quickly want to make three other points. That you mentioned mega churches in particular was our outreach, and that's in the sense of a proxy for evangelicals in the U.S. And I'd say there's another thing. Evangelical churches are, I'd say, inherently more concerned about Israel than they are about domestic Jewish anti-Semitism. And that's a kind of interesting conundrum, right? Where, and reasons for that are obvious. Israel's the Holy Land. It's where Jesus was from. There's natural affinity for Israel. Eschatology, points to a kind of a commitment to Israel for end times fulfillment. So you have a lot of interest in Israel as a nation state and the regathering of Jews, and it comes from certain theological traditions that are dominant in American evangelicalism. So there's an interest in, and I'm not saying that American Christians are ever for persecution, but the idea that persecution is inevitable kind of is, in a sense, part of the conversation with Jews. And finally, there's a complexity, I think, for some American evangelicals and U.S. Jews, in that historically the U.S. Jewish community has been much more aligned with mainline churches and more liberal politics, socially liberal. And so there isn't a kind of a natural relational capital of trust that's been built for years and years and years, sometimes even exacerbated by, on the Jewish side, concerns about evangelism, so that you don't have the empathy built as much directly between Jews and Christian evangelicals that can help you understand this is a threat to your neighbor or a loved friend. And so I think for all those reasons, I think American evangelicals probably are less focused on anti-Semitism than other issues.
Well, thank you, Mark. And there would, if we'd had the time, we would need to break down every single statement and discuss them further. And maybe we'll have a chance to get back to them later in the program. But Gregory, you sometimes would go as far as to say that there is a problem at the core of Christian tradition. And of course, looking at history, there would be many things that would seem to confirm your hypothesis. The fact that the greatest crime against humanity took place in Christian Europe, in Christian Germany. But would you want to elaborate?
Thank you, Thomas, and it's good to be with you all in this webinar. How long do you have?
Just 1 hour for this particular question.
I think it's fair to say that there's been for a long time a problem in Christian theology in every denomination, in every Christian, in every part of the Christian world. Anti-Semitism has unfortunately been very present. Of course, it's linked to the false teaching and assumption that the Jews are collectively responsible for the death of Jesus, and unfortunately, it's something that is still considered or understood or even taught almost as literally as this, and so this is the core, one of the main aspects of this anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism is a disease that mutates, like all the virus, and we know a little bit about that today in a concrete way. But it mutates, it changes all the time. There's been many aspects, but there is a basis, a core to it, and we touched a little bit on it on Wednesday at our memorial. I mentioned a few things in my speech. I'll probably come back to that a little bit today, but just to respond, I hope a little bit quicker, is I would say that it all comes back to Abel and Cain. And for many centuries, the Jews have been described as Cain. They've been portrayed as Cain, and Jesus as Abel. And so it was always with this thinking that's why the Christian world invented the notion of the wandering Jew, wandering as Cain around the world, and there's lots of problematic things to this. Now, I think it's quite the opposite, actually. Things are really the opposite of what has been described and taught in the Christian world for centuries. It's really, the Christian world is really Cain. And I think that this is where it comes back to this prayer that was attributed to Pope John 23 of recognizing that as the Christians, we are Cain, and we killed and brought a lot of suffering on Abel, our brother. But just to finish just this answer, there's lots of different elements, like also the name of Judah, the traitor. Unfortunately, it's Judah. Judah, like Judah in the Old Testament, and Judah is Yehudi, which means Jewish. So it's part of the problem. But really, the overall problem is, and it's linked to what I described as the blueprint of anti-Semitism, is this universal aspiration of Christianism, of being able to bring a universal answer, which is valid for everyone, for every human being. And so every time you do this, and I'll probably come back to this, every time you try to do this, then the Jews are always an exception. The Jews are always seen to be different. And so every time you try to go in that direction, you put the Jew in a place of exception, and then of course anti-Semitism pops up, and so it's part of this universal aspirations of Christianity. Sorry, that was a long answer. You gave me 1 hour. I think I was a bit better than that.
Thank you, Gregory. We will frame the conversation in trying to have 3 segments, and we will have a short musical interlude between the segments, and the first musical interlude comes here. Thank you. We will broaden the discussion a little bit and look at the situation around us. And of course, not only Americans, but everyone from around the world have witnessed what we never thought could happen in Washington, D.C. on Capitol Hill, that we all look up to as this beacon of light. But these are very troubling times with a lot of polarization and radicalization, extremism of different forms, not only in the United States, but obviously in Europe as well. We know also from history that these type of these times would also make it especially difficult for the Jewish people. Once you need to find a scapegoat, it so easily comes to the Jews, and we hear about conspiracy theories where there always seems to be a Jewish mastermind. Mark Rogers, I know this is a lot on your mind and on your heart to see, well, how can we find a way forward in the United States, but obviously this goes for the rest of the Western world. What are your reflections when I give you this background?
Thank you, Thomas. First of all, I just want to confess I'm not always able to practice what I preach, and I want to make sure that everybody understands that. I did write a blog post. I think that might have spurred you on to include me today. My website is called claphamgroup.com, and I called on America to consider a national campaign to rebuild social capital. And I think you can look online and get a quick sense, very practical suggestions. But since this is a Holocaust Remembrance Sunday, and I thought I would speak a bit more to the faith community that's maybe listening in. So several thoughts about how to address this kind of polarization. First, just remember that Scripture commends us. In fact, it actually commands us to listen before speaking, especially with anger. In Proverbs 18:13, if one gives an answer before he hears, it is folly and is shame. Proverbs 18:2, a fool takes no pleasure in understanding, but only in expressing his opinion. James 1:19, let every person be quick to hear, slow to speak, slow to anger. And my favorite, Proverbs 17, even a fool who keeps silent is considered wise. So when he closes his lips, he is deemed intelligent. I mean, there's a lot of to be said for just listening first before speaking. And we have a culture now where social media has just exacerbated the problem in terms of speaking before listening. So first is listening. Second, very quickly, is that polarization in our context, I think it's true globally, really creates a temptation to treat somebody that you disagree with, the other, as an evil. to treat your opponent not just as wrong or that you disagree with, but literally your enemy and evil. And I think that's particularly challenging for Christians, who understand the reality of a demonic force and principalities and powers. So when we see someone that we disagree with at a deep level, we can easily demonize them. And so one challenge for us is not to literally demonize our opponents, but to actually love them as Christ asks us to be. And that is really, I'd say a particular challenge to the church or Christians, who often aren't sadly in this culture right now known for loving their enemies, which I guess is to my third and final point. The other challenge is to recapture the word compromise. I worked on the Hill 16 years. Our founders created a system that literally runs on compromise. You've got 3 branches of government, you've got a bicameral system, you've got things like the supermajority in the Senate. All this requires compromise. And compromise to find common good is not inherently a bad thing. But as Christians, if we look at someone that we disagree with as evil, we know we're not to compromise with evil. And so how do you do that in a context where you've got language, which actually is over exploiting or over sensationalizing, the context that we're operating in. If people can call Mike Pence, a Judas, this language of demonizing makes it really difficult to compromise and do that. So Christian leaders have to stand up against this language, this kind of rhetorical warfare, especially in the Christian context, and lead us into a much better way of having engagement around the need to find common ground. So those are some quick observations, Thomas.
Thank you, Mark. And I'm sure that Marcus have additional observations from the other side of the Atlantic, because you worked both in Brussels and in Helsinki.
Or actually, it's almost like Mark, you were listening to my sermon that I delivered in church this morning. Since I was actually about to say something similar, I spoke on Romans 2 and verse 1 about not passing judgment. And I think that is a crucial problem. The same thing as you said about demonizing the other side, about speaking about the other side as evil, because what he says, Paul, in Romans 1 or Romans 2 and verse 1 is that do not pass judgment, because if you do pass judgment on someone else, then you're also condemning yourself. But I think that as churches, we have a pretty bad record on that. We have been very good actually on passing judgment on other people. We have been speaking about other people as sinners and that they need to behave. And we have not really been, I would say, reaching out in the way Jesus is learning us to do in the Bible, when he will sit down with the sinner and he will instill hope in the person who thinks in a different way, and he's trying to show that person a path to a brighter future. And I think that is definitely something we need to do. We need to sit down and have dinner. And that is actually, I was working with Martti Ahtisaari, the former president of Finland, also a Nobel Peace Prize laureate. And he said actually the first thing he do when he normally went into a conflict, he said that you need to sit down around the table. You need to share a dinner. Because if you share a dinner and you should have like no agenda, you will just sit down and you will have dinner together. And already by doing that, you will find a common ground. And that is the biblical way. That is the way Jesus did it. And I think we really need to, in some way, to get back and find some way of a common public space. I don't exactly know how to do it. When I was a child, we had like 2 TV channels in Finland. And at 8:30 in the evening, when we had the news was actually broadcasted on both TV channels, so that everybody would actually listen to the same news. But today we know that people are listening to news sources coming from all over the places, and you will just choose and pick.
Yeah.
And as a church, I think we need to try to, in some way, reunite and find a common space.
Thomas, go ahead. A 30-second comment, just real quick. I want to say I'm a real strong believer in the importance of actual projects or relational kind of collaboration to overcome polarization. I think you can't really build relational capital trust if you're not working together towards something and learning in that process the kind of intangibles, right, that don't come from just knowing intellectually, but getting to know personally. And I've been part of projects and encouraged them where we've had folks that are very different in terms of their worldview or their ideologies, and we've given them a joint project to work on together, and that builds trust. You know, it's so that actual process of working together, collaboration, I think is something that we need to find ways to create ourselves in our churches and our communities.
Personally, that's why I love diplomacy and the United Nations.
I was going to say that this sounds like a promotional video for the Forum for Culture Diplomacy and our luncheons at the UN. But coming back to the question of polarization, sadly, what we've seen time and time again is that there are times when the extremes can unite, and they can unite on the evil of the Jewish people. So you have the extreme right, you have the extreme left, all of a sudden finding common ground. And it doesn't, as Marcus said earlier, it's not only a fringe issue anymore. You find many different political parties with different value sets who suddenly come to an agreement when it comes to the evil nature of the Jewish people and the fact that they are masterminding this world towards destruction. Gregory, why is this the case?
I think somehow it's part of the nature of anti-Semitism. It is contradictory. I'm a logician, and I love to study infinity. We have some kind of classification of all the different sizes of infinity, and at the top of all the diagram of the different sizes of infinity, there's one which is greater than all the others. It's 0 equals 1. It's a contradiction. And somehow it just shows, the nature of anti-Semitism. The Jews have always been had the reproach of one thing and the contrary of that thing. It's always been like that. But I would say that it all comes back really again to this blueprint of anti-Semitism. And perhaps let me explain very quickly what I mean by this blueprint of anti-Semitism. It comes back in a way to this text of Tacitus, the first century, where he realized that there's only one people who is different from all the others, and that all the others they can unite on what is sacred and what is abhorrent, what is profane. But the Jews and what Moses taught them goes on the other side. It's contradictory. It's different, and you can never bring everyone together when you realize that yes, there is a tradition that cannot agree to what is sacred and what is profane. And so it's this very surprising text of Tacitus, which I think explains this blueprint. And so this blueprint is just that the whole world always wanted to be one, in a way, to come together. And the Jewish people is always this exception that prevents the whole world from coming as one. And so when you of course, I simplified it a little bit, but when you look at the different ideologies, be it communism or Nazism or whatever the ideology, you always have this this tendency and this aspiration of being universal. And so when you want to be universal, unfortunately, the Jewish people will always stand out. And so that's why it comes, it will appear in any universal project. And I think there's a really an important warning, is that if one has a universal project, and it's not saying that a universal project is bad. Universality is not a bad thing, but you always need to accept that you will have cracks. You always need to accept that there will be some exceptions, and one of those exceptions will be the Jewish people. You have to accept it. And if you don't accept it, you go from trying to be universal to being totalitarian. You go from universality to totality, and this is what we have seen so many times, unfortunately. So it's a and again, to come back to also to our subject, Christianism has had the same fault, this same problem that the others had. So again, universalism or universal aspirations are not necessarily bad, but we need to understand what they imply.
This is interesting also, looking at the Durban, the UN conference against racism in Durban in 2001, which was supposed to get rid of racism, but instead it is today known as the launching pad of the new anti-Semitism.
Absolutely, it's really thank you for bringing it up. It's like one of the best examples of what I just said, is that when you try to fight racism globally, universally, then it doesn't work, because you always, the Jews will always stand out, and so this conference in Durban, it ended up with having some anti-Semitic language even in some of the texts, and which is really outrageous. That a conference against racism would give birth to some more anti-Semitism. But it's always like that. It's something that we need to keep in mind, because we cannot try to fight racism and anti-Semitism together. It doesn't work. We need to fight racism, but we need to fight anti-Semitism, and to fight it separately. And just very quickly, another example in a way is pacifism. Between the First and the Second World War, there were a number of intellectuals and writers. Of course, there was an intellectual anti-Semitic background there, but at the time in Europe, and in France in particular. But when you look at you try to understand what was the thinking of those who were writing very anti-Semitic texts, such as Louis-Ferdinand Céline, one of the most famous French writers. His problem with the Jews was that he was a fervent defender of pacifism. So he wanted to make sure that after the First World War, that we would never know such a war. So what was important is pacifism above all. That was the priority. Now, he analyzed the situation, and he thought, who is stopping us from having peace? It's the Jewish people again. And so, because he made an idol out of peace, then he became an anti-Semite. I'm sure there are other reasons, but it's just an example again of this, and you see it in many aspects. And just perhaps one last example is equality. There's always this yearning of equality. And it's normal to have this. And it's quite contradictory that the Jews are certainly those who gave the world this notion of equality of rights. But at the same time, every time we try to preach equality, that everyone's equal at the same level, etc., then the Jews always ended up being pointed out and singled out.
There's a lot to take in, and this will be a good time to go into our last segment. But before we do that, we will have a recorded message from someone that all the four of us know and admire, and I know many others. Os Guinness, author, social critic, who sent us a recorded message. Let's listen to Os Guinness.
Anti-Semitism is the oldest, darkest, and the most persistent stain on the long record of humanity. There are many roots to this malignancy, but the Christian contribution to the persecution and scattering of the people of God is a terrible offense before God and a shameful blot on the story of the Church, of Europe, and of Western civilization. I speak as a Christian, a follower of Jesus, and I wholeheartedly lend my voice and support this stand against the current resurgence of anti-Semitism. I'm only grateful that, led by the Dutch and the English Reformation, Christians welcomed the Jews back to their countries and gave them their freedom. My own great-grandfather was among evangelical leaders such as William Wilberforce and Lord Shaftesbury, who worked tirelessly for the restoration of the Jews to their homeland. His work was well known to Theodore Herzl and to both Lord Balfour, the author of the Balfour Declaration, and to General Allenby, who liberated Jerusalem in 1917. Anti-Semitism is not only profoundly evil, it is foolish. There is no higher view of human worth or of freedom, justice, peace, community, truth, and words than those truths passed on to us as a gift of God and of the Jews. President John Adams was right. The Hebrews have contributed more to civilize humanity than any other nation. Heinrich Heine was right. After Sinai, freedom has always spoken with a Hebrew accent. It is not too much to say that the gifts of the Jews are the shining key to the human future, and indeed the very Magna Carta of humanity. All too often, never again has become all over again. Let us stand resolutely in our time. So whatever the future may hold, and whatever others may do, we may each take our stand and say, but not through me.
And here we say a big thank you to Os Guinness, but also thank you for the music to Kolodbach Ensemble, who have provided the musical interludes. Before I let any of you comment on what Os Guinness said, maybe just worth reflecting on the fact that there has always been two traditions in Christianity. One which Os was explaining, and his great-grandfather was an example of people who always felt very deeply identified with the Jewish people, showed appreciation, also cared for their well-being, and also the restoration of Israel as a Jewish homeland. Whereas, on the other hand, you have a very dark history, Gregory also mentioned, of clear Christian anti-Semitism. And the big question, of course, is in 2021 and beyond, which of these traditions will prevail. But what can we as Christians do to be on the right side of history and with the challenges that we are facing right now? And maybe it is, Mark Rogers, also combined to this general polarization. How can we be peace builders, but also in doing that, not neglecting, as Gregory said, the Jewish people when they become difficult in a way and not are in accordance with our universal solutions to every problem. Mark Rogers.
Yeah, this is an important area to discuss, and it's a complex one. I'll be honest. The Jewish community is caught in the middle, if you would, of polarization, in the sense that both extremes have anti-Semitic elements and tendencies. And in some ways, that what they do have in common, as I said earlier, is this anti-Semitism. And so they are caught in the middle. Three quick points on this. We were asked a few years ago to help a filmmaker, Andrew Goldberg, who I'd worked with earlier on a film, promote his PBS series on anti-Semitism. It was called Anti-Semitism in 4 Mutations. And the 4 mutations were: 1, radical far-right anti-Semitism in the US; 2, anti-Semitic nationalism in Hungary, expressed in part by demonizing George Soros, but also as a proxy for broader conspiracy theories; 3, leftist opposition in the UK with the BDS movement and others, Labour Party; and then 4th, anti-Jewish, anti-Israel sentiment in Islamic extremism. So those were the 4 mutations. And as we approached American evangelical churches to support this and use this platform as a platform to discuss anti-Semitism, we got pushed back in a couple of ways. One, it did not portray Christians as the defenders of Jews, like the hiding place. In fact, it actually suggested that some of the anti-Semitic language is cloaked in Christian language. Well, that's, we don't want to admit that, I think, for many of us. Second, it portrayed Soros as a victim. Well, for many conservative evangelicals, he is the opposite, right? And third, it was PBS. And again, for many American evangelicals, PBS is not a trusted source. It's false news. And so for a lot of reasons, I think it was difficult to get folks to embrace that, but I think it spoke to a deeper problem, which is our unwillingness to look at our own implication with anti-Semitism as Christians, not just past, but also current. Which brings me to the second point quickly, that there is institutionalized anti-Semitism in the far right and the far left. And if we turn blind to our own part of the polarization, we actually become numb to its impact and its infiltration into our own communities. We did a study on the religious roots of radicalization, especially violent extremism recently. And for all the violent extreme groups, there was something called the red pill. The one and only thing they all had in common was anti-Semitism, which brings me to the final point. And this is one that's very disconcerting for Christians today. And that is, we're unaware often of the encroachment of far right on the evangelical side, anti-Semitism that's cloaked in the language of conspiracy theories. And we have to be willing, whether it is the Proud Boys, praying before they march on the Hill, to more things that are obvious, right? Which is KKK and burning crosses. We have to be willing to understand that this has an infiltration through conspiracy theories like QAnon into our own communities. And our own leaders have to stand up to these theories and this kind of movement and call it out and confront it before it infiltrates the church further.
We say a big amen to that. Marcus, again, over to you. You were now one of the first pastors to adopt the IRA working definition on anti-Semitism. What shall we do next?
And following up on Mark, and now I lived in the US for 3 years, and what struck me when I lived in the US, I think you have much more of the so-called replacement theology in the US. In Finland, in my church, and I think most Christians in Finland still consider the Jews and Israel as the chosen people. But in many churches, I was really surprised when I lived in the US. You could see it actually that the church had taken over the role of Israel. And I think one of these are like one of the, I think the biggest root for the anti-Semitic movement that I think is so strong, as you pointed out, Mark, in the US and especially in the fringes and the right wing. And I think it's scary. And of course, when the newly elected Congresswoman, Marjorie Taylor Greene, when she blamed the wildfires in California on a Jewish, some kind of space laser conspiracy. And in the following moment, she said, "We will pray for you in California." Then, I mean, it is almost like the church or some churches have been co-opted by radical partisans. And I think, I mean, if the church doesn't speak up when you see things like that happen, I think it's really, really problematic. And I think we need to do that. I also read that you have of the religiously motivated hate crimes in the US. This statistics is like 2 years old from FBI. I think 60% are directed towards Jewish people, 60%. So it is a problem. And if the church doesn't speak up, I think the church has lost its position of being salt and light. The church should not be partisan. It should not go in and like it actually is doing now, to endorse different candidates. I think the church shouldn't endorse candidates, but I think the church should definitely react and act when you can see anti-Semitic crime, hate crime growing.
Thank you, Marcus. This is getting better and better, and still we're drawing to a close. Gregory, in Europe, and I know in Germany in particular, there's almost something like a Holocaust fatigue. There's a generation that grew up after the war, had to ask for forgiveness, to repent, forgive, repent, and they seem to say, we don't want to talk about this anymore. How can we? What should we do?
Yes, I hear that there is a Holocaust fatigue. It's true that I'm not a German, so certainly it's probably very hard to put oneself in their shoes. But I must say I have Christian anti-Semitism fatigue. But I think that the answer to Holocaust fatigue is it just shows that we haven't understood what happened. We have really no idea of what happened, and I think it shows that we must really let the new generations understand what really happened, the extent of what happened. I gave a little message to a few French-speaking churches this morning, and especially in Switzerland. And I told them, do you realize that 6 million Jews were killed? 6 million Jews. And do you realize also that in 1940, we were only 4 million in Switzerland. So it's the equivalent of a nation, of a country completely exterminated that happened. And thank God it failed. The Jews were not exterminated. But I think it's important to really recognize what happened, to remember. You know, it's part of those Jewish contributions to humanity, is this teaching of remembering. So important, of remembering, and remembering in such a way that you relive it. It's when you take, for example, the Jewish holiday of Passover. You don't just remember what happened of this exodus out of Egypt. You really live it every year. The rabbis teach that you have to consider yourself as leaving Egypt at every Passover. You have to consider that you're with your stick and you're eating unleavened bread because you didn't have time to make it for the bread to for the leaven to come in the bread. And I think the answer to this is really what can we do? What can we really do? And I would say that one thing that is really difficult in our Christian world today is that when we talk about the Jewish people, many times there is always this yearning of preaching salvation to the Jews. And I would say that sometimes there is you could say some form of anti-Semitism sometimes in this way of looking at the Jews. We need to, after the Shoah, we need to remember, but we also need to learn to love the Jews in such a way that we love them as they are. We don't want them to be someone else. We don't want them to be like us or like everybody else. We don't want them to become Christians. We just want them to be who they are and to love them as they are. And I think that's the greatest love, of unconditional love. And that's, I know it's a difficulty in the Christian world. And I would say that to love them, it's not something difficult, especially when we understand, when we see everything that they have given us. And Osgun has pointed that out a little bit in his statement. And this is the approach that we've had, that with the Forum for Cultural Diplomacy, with our work at the United Nations. It's explaining to the nations how much the Jewish people, the Jewish culture has contributed to who we are. And so then anti-Semitism doesn't make any sense anymore. Is that anti-Semitism many times has been built on this jealousy, really, of thinking that the Jews have something that we have not. And it's where it's very different from racism, where racism is thinking that we are superior to the other. Anti-Semitism is a little bit the antithesis in that. But the Jews did the opposite. They didn't just keep what they had. There's this verse in the Bible where it talks about the Jewish people as the people treasure, the treasure people of God. And Am Segula, and we all know this this term of chosen people, of Anivcha. And there's been lots of misunderstanding of this. I'll just finish what I was about to say by saying that this chosen people, if we really look what it means a people of distinction. It means a people who is able to make this the distinction between something and the other. So they can help us make the distinction. It's not only just being chosen. But yes, I think as Osgun has pointed out, it's so important to recognize everything they have given us.
Thank you. We are coming to the final minute. Not that we have anything that will expire, but we want to be also value your time, and Mark and Marcus for being for joining us in this webinar. And so I would just give it over to all the three of you, just if you have one final comment. The question is still, how can we make a difference? How can we help stem this tide of anti-Semitism and radicalization? So we'll start in Washington, D.C.
Thank you, Thomas. I think in kind of quick closing, first you can read my blog if you want a kind of a program for reducing or increasing social capital. Secondly, I think churches need to be persuaded to create a space of conversation about how to listen, and that requires creating the tools for them to do that. And I think that's one of the biggest challenges is I hear from pastors, they don't have the tools to both listen, understand better about this history of anti-Semitism, and then thirdly, be able to discern where some of the conspiracy theories, again, where the left or the right, it could be Antifa as well, are coming in together and creating this environment that is putting anti-Semitism back onto the national platform. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Marcus.
Yeah, I think that I agree with Mark on that one, and I see myself now as a pastor. I really want to be part of creating a public space also, not just a religious space, but a public space, a political space where we can meet each other and really to discuss. That is one thing. At the same time, I also really think that church leaders, they really have to stand up and not be quiet. I think that is something also that has to be done. And these are not like opposites. You can combine them. But I think many times now, church leaders are just like trying to avoid many difficult discussions instead of having those difficult discussions. So that would be my medicine for the moment.
Thank you, Marcus. And Gregory.
I think the medicine to anti-Semitism is recognizing everything that they have contributed to our world, to humanity, and to who we are. But I think as for the Christian world, I think it's really so important to start changing the narrative and the way of looking at the world and at things. I mentioned before that there was this wrong teaching that Jewish people were Cain, and I think it's important to turn this around, and for the Christians to start taking this this important call of accepting and wanting to be the keeper of their brother Abel, Israel, the Jewish people. And we came up with this slogan, which I think says it all, and especially in a Christian context, is "I am my brother's keeper." I think that that's such like it's the best answer. Unfortunately, Cain responded to the Lord's question by another question: "Am I my brother's keeper?" And I think it's important that we're not answering the question of Cain. We're answering the question of the Lord. And where is your brother? And our answer is that we want to be. So I think it's important that the Christian world rise up to say, "I am my brother's keeper." And just one last thing is that many times in the Christian world, everything is seen through New Testament eyes. And I think it's important, I hear that many times in the Jewish world, that they're waiting for the Christians to start doing the things the other way around, is reading the New Testament with Old Testament eyes, taking the Old Testament as the fundamentals, as you know, reversing this way of looking at everything. And I think this would be a way for the Christian world to understand a lot better the Jews, the Jewish culture.
Let me conclude. I know Gregory likes, like in a good Jewish tradition, questions. And God, if I'm not mistaken, had a question for Cain, and that is, "Where are you?" And
that was for Adam, but I think it's for Cain also in a way.
Well, we'll adapt a little bit as we go along, but I think the question stands. As we see the rise of anti-Semitism, you know, God is saying, where are we? And our answer here today is Hineni, here we are. And I'm so grateful for Marcus in Helsinki and Mark in Washington, D.C. and Gregory currently in Basel, that we can work together to find solutions and build bridges and create common space, which is so much needed in these next years. So thank you again. This is European Coalition for Israel, and you will find us on ec4i.org, and we will come back with a new webinar very soon. But for today, we say thank you and goodbye.